Freedom at sunset. Some facts about the hijacking of Indian Airlines IC 814 25 years back. As the sound of Christmas bells echoed through the air on December 24, 1999, the festive spirit was suddenly disrupted. Indian Airlines Flight 814 or IC 814 bound from Kathmandu to Delhi was hijacked by five masked men, thrusting not just its passengers but entire India into a week of dread and turmoil. Scheduled to land at Delhi's airport, IC 814 was hijacked just 40 minutes after it took off from Kathmandu's Tribhuvan International Airport. Ultimately, the government agreed to the hijackers' key demands. 1. The release of Masood Azhar, who went on to found Jaish-e-Mohammed, the army of Muhammad, which attacked Parliament in 2001 and staged other spectacular terror raids on India's soil. 2. British born terrorist Omar Saeed Sheikh, later accused of the murder of journalist Daniel Pearl. There had already been several plots to force India to release Masood Azhar. Saeed had attempted to take a group of foreign tourists hostage in 1994 to free Azhar, but the intelligence bureau foiled his attempt after a shootout and he ended up in jail. Then, terrorists seized six foreign hostages in Kashmir a year later to secure Azhar's release. Negotiation attempts failed and only one hostage escaped, another was beheaded, and the rest are presumed dead. At Amritsar, the Punjab police wanted the central government's permission for its commandos trained to carry out counter terror operations to take measures and free the hostages. The center wanted the elite National Security Guard NSG commandos to be flown to Amritsar and carry out the rescue operation. But the NSG was entangled in a traffic jam. When they reached Amritsar, the plane had already left 40 minutes ago. Other officials highlight that such operations, like the successful Israeli one at Entebbe, are very complex. They are usually done after wearing down hijackers with hours of negotiation and getting an idea of where each terrorist is in the plane and how they are armed and their state of mind. Storming the plane didn't materialize, and the plane was forced off Amritsar after staying there for 55 long minutes for refueling. A gun to his head, the pilot took off from Amritsar. There shouldn't be any mischief. Go west. This was the first thing the chief of the five hijackers told Sharan, putting a gun to his head. The gunman still behind him, he flew so low above Lahore that airport authorities were forced to allow him to land after initial refusing permission. They wanted to go to Lahore or Kabul, Sharan said. For the entire first night, they had a gun to my head. After that, they would point the gun only when they asked me to do something. The Air Traffic Control ATC in Lahore had initially refused him permission to land. The runway lights had been switched off. I was flying the aircraft too low over Lahore city to crash land and had kept the transponder switched on so that Lahore ATC could see how close we were to a disaster. It was a gamble that paid off. The Lahore ATC got scared. We were about 40 seconds from crash landing when the Lahore ATC told me they were allowing us to land and switched on the runway lights. As commander of the flight, I feel the passengers who pay for flying safely should not be harmed at all. The operations manual in those days clearly stated that all the instructions of the hijackers should be followed, he said. When the aircraft landed in Lahore, the US Consul General was instructed to visit the airport and report back to Washington. Likewise, it was a discreet nudge from the US that facilitated the landing of the hijacked plane in Dubai. After initial denial of landing rights, permission to land came from Al Minhad Air Base in the UAE, where 27 passengers and the body of 25-year-old Rupin Katyal, who had been killed by one of the hijackers, were released. At Dubai, some military action was also contemplated with American assistance, but the hijackers took off for Kandahar before the scheme could be operational. In Kandahar, the hijacked plane was parked near the terminal while the relief plane carrying the officials was at the other end of the runway, nearly 2 kilometers away. The hijackers were armed with knives to start with and only started brandishing pistols after their brief stopover in Lahore. In reality, the most closely guarded secret was that the Raw and Analysis Wing Kathmandu station chief was on board. Indian government officers ensured his name was never released and the hijackers never got to know he was on board. The slightest hint that he was on board might have been fatal. Unknown to the hijackers, there was another passenger on board who would have been worth much more than the 25 million US dollars they were demanding from the Indian government. That was Swiss Italian Roberto Girori, director of De La Rue Gigori, a Lausanne based company that had a virtual monopoly at the time on the design and production of banknotes around the world. He and a companion were on board the flight, and the Swiss government was desperate to get him out unharmed. Not a whisper about Giroi being on plane was allowed to become public. Swiss Italian tycoon Giroi was even stronger in his praise. Giroi told Times magazine that what I experienced on the plane has changed me forever. I don't know what it is Hinduism, the so called fatalism of Indians, but the way the passengers stayed so calm throughout, even the children, was exemplary. I told myself if the plane had been full of Italians or French, it would have been very difficult. The hijackers forced passengers to sit with their heads bent for hours on end. The conditions on the plane also became appalling very swiftly, and many passengers ate the minimum possible so that they wouldn't need to visit the toilet. Give us straight answers. Keep your sentences short. Read the piece of paper thrown out of the plane. The hijackers had sent their demands to the Indian negotiators. Their initial demands were release of 36 terrorists, give rupees 860 crore, and the coffin of martyr Sajjad Afghani. In 1991, Sajjad Afghani became commander in chief of the terrorist outfit Harkatul Ansar in Srinagar. In June 1994, he was arrested with terrorist Masood Azhar, then the General Secretary of the terror organization Harkatul Ansar, by the Indian Border Security Force. Afghani, a fragile looking but tough man who had even fought the Russians, has been described as the biggest catch. He was kept in a high security prison, Kotbawala jail in Jammu. He dug a 23-foot long tunnel inside his prison. Had he dug a little further, he and other terrorists might have managed to escape. But the guards caught them, and 11 prisoners, including Afghani, were shot dead while trying to flee. The demand for the coffin of Sajjad Afghani brought the Taliban hardliners to the front, and they began to bring in pressure that the hijackers withdraw their demands. The Taliban Supreme Council, Shura, got involved and held a meeting. It finally concluded that the hijackers' demand for money was un Islamic and should be dropped. The Taliban leaders said if the hijackers refused to comply, they would be asked to fly out of Kandahar. The hijackers spoke to the Indian government through walkie talkies provided by the Air Traffic Control Kandahar, and they used the VHF sets of the aircraft. A big complication was that it was Ramjan, so negotiations could take place only at night after the Taliban had sated themselves on their evening feast. Mr. Doval usually led negotiations for 3 hours every night. There were moments when the Indian team felt threatened, despite Taliban assurances nothing would happen to them on Afghan soil. Once the hijacked aircraft was stationed in Kandahar, the help Washington was able to provide was naturally limited. With no direct access to the Taliban, India tried to ensure that a maximum number of international observers descended on Kandahar. To begin with, it was decided to involve the United Nations in a big way. The agency responded by sending Eric D. Mull, the UNDP chief in Pakistan, as an observer and negotiator. Though Mr. Mull's negotiation abilities drew some flack, he did manage to persuade the Taliban authorities to pay some heed to conditions inside the aircraft. Passengers, for example, by the fourth day, the toilets had become virtually unusable and the smell unbearable. It was the presence of an international team organized at India's initiative that played a major role in improving conditions on the aircraft. By the sixth day of the hijack, the passengers had enough food, drinking water, and improved sanitary facilities. These were not glamorous achievements, but the advances have to be measured against the difficulties of dealing with a fanatical and somewhat brutal hijackers on the one hand, and a Taliban that was supremely unmindful of the niceties of normal diplomatic conduct. Getting through to the Taliban was the biggest challenge. The problem was India's track record of unflinching support to the hated Hezbollah regime. For the first 2 days, we went slow because we were waiting to see what stand the Taliban took. The first contacts were made, ironically, courtesy a section of US educated Taliban leaders. Through various interlocutors, including Pakistanis, India was able to impress the Taliban that the hijack actually presented an opportunity to the Paria regime. The approach appears to have worked. Despite the emotional links of the Taliban with the cause of their hijackers, it was quick to distance itself from the act of piracy. After the first meeting of the Shura, the regime made it clear that it would not countenance any harm to the passengers. Violence against passengers would invite sharp, swift retribution. However, it is clear that the Taliban operated on parallel tracks. Many of the hijacked passengers believe that the arsenal of the hijackers was replenished by supplies from the ground in Kandahar. The hijackers initially possessed 2 pistols and 2 hand grenades, but after they landed in Kandahar, 4 more hand grenades appeared. As a first step, India has secured the assurance that neither the hijackers nor the released terrorists would be able to get political asylum in Afghanistan. That would leave these fugitives from international law with no alternative but to turn to Pakistan, thereby confirming Indian charges of Pakistan sponsored terrorism in the region. The dozen or so NSG commanders who accompanied the Indian delegation didn't get a chance to put their skills into practice. The Taliban made it absolutely clear that there was no question of any foreign power using Afghan soil to mount a police action on the aircraft. Indian negotiator insisted the choice of the 5 would be India's and wouldn't include any Indian national. The hijackers didn't buy that. So the final compromise was that only 3 militants of the hijackers' choice would be released. Apart from Maulana Masood Azhar, a Pakistan national, and Ahmad Omar Syed, a British national, the hijackers chose Mushtaq Ahmad Jargar, a Kashmiri terrorist. 3, 5, or 36. The release of even a single terrorist is calculated to draw flag. But when the cabinet met on the morning of December 31st, the government was left with limited choices. Intelligence agencies reported that the increasingly desperate hijackers had decided that January 1st would be their final deadline. After this, they would either start killing the passengers one by one or blow themselves up along with the aircraft, passengers, and all. After their release, many passengers have confirmed that the hijackers were firm about the New Year's deadline. At the same time, there were clear indications that the Taliban would insist that the aircraft leave Afghanistan territory by January 1st, with the service chiefs clearly ruling out any military option and the Afghanistan insisting that the hijackers wouldn't settle for anything less than three militants. It was decided that the drama could not be prolonged any longer. There are several aspects of the 1999 Kandahar hijack that remain shrouded in mystery, especially the two red bags and a black briefcase that played a crucial role in the incident. One of the red bags was checked into the cargo hold of IC 814 by the terrorists at Kathmandu International Airport. It was said to have explosives, which made the Indian government cautious in its response to the hijacking crisis. Then there is a black briefcase that was carried by Indian officials accompanying Foreign Minister on the flight to Kandahar. The black briefcase of a senior Indian Airlines officer contained 1 lakh US dollars in cash. The cash was to be used to pay for the fuel in Kandahar. The estimate was $40,000, but the team was carrying a buffer. They knew the Taliban was not going to furnish any cash receipt for landing charges, refueling of the plane, etc. So they needed witnesses. The secrets of the red bag were revealed after the fallout of Taliban regime in 2001 and the arrest of Taliban Foreign Minister Wakil Ahmad Mutawakil, who was negotiating with the hijackers. The red bag belonged to one of the hijackers. It contained explosives and possibly the terrorists' real passports as well. In their hurry, they had forgotten it in the hold. It found out from the local worker that they had found one bag and there were 5 grenades in it. The 5 hijackers were put in a vehicle and that were escorted by 2 armed vehicles, one in front and one at the rear, till the Pakistan border. They would not be using the normal border passage but instead use one of the Pak Afghanistan secret routes which the Mujahideen used during the Russian occupation, where there would be no border formalities like immigration and customs. That is how the 5 hijackers of IC 814 disappeared. Thank you for listening.